I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from Jordan Liz, Associate Professor of Philosophy at San José University, and a regular contributor to Common Dreams, a current events and politics website. Jordan and I will be talking on this edition of the program about the question of reforming ICE and why he believes we should not be talking about reforming ICE, but rather abolishing it, and abolishing the Department of Homeland Security as well. Much of this conversation will be centered on the fact that ICE came out of the Bush-era global war on terror, the post-9/11 moment in which an obsession with security led to more and more militarized policing. Are we lurching towards police state USA, and is ICE a part of that? That's what Jordan Liz is on the program to talk about, and we'll get into it in the conversation to follow. But before that, I want to remind you that this show is almost entirely listener funded, except for my one sponsor, the mighty Mike Swanson of wallstreetwindow.com. So if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. Also, if you can, please head on over to wallstreetwindow.com, Mike Swanson's financial and trading newsletter. You will not regret it. I have had listeners make a return on investment for Mike's trading tips, and I highly recommend signing up to the newsletter. If you subscribe, I believe you can also get a copy of Mike's free ebook, The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I've ever used. Check it out at wallstreetwindow.com. And with that being said, let's get to the conversation with Jordan Liz. Welcome to Parallax Views, a first-time guest I'm very happy to have on the show. Jordan Liz is an associate professor of philosophy at San José State University, and he specializes in issues of race, immigration, and the politics of belonging. And I came across his work recently on Common Dreams when he wrote a piece entitled "ICE is the Domestic Terror Threat." Since then, he's written multiple articles, especially in light of the killings of Alex Preddy and Renee Good. There is so much happening right now, and I think he's provided some good commentary, especially the article Abolish ICE and DHS2. We'll get into all of that and more. How are you doing, Jordan Liz?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
So, I guess straight out the chute, we should talk about what has happened in the past week with Alex Preddy and Renee Good. Where do you want to start with that? Because I feel like something that is getting missed in all of this is that this may not be a bug. It may be a feature of ICE in a lot of ways.
Oh, definitely. And so in that, in the Abolish ICE piece, I argue that, for a lot of people, this is the first time they're sort of encountering ICE's tactics. But these tactics aren't particularly new. ICE has always done these kind of raids. ICE has always, been very aggressive towards people, even in ways that have forced the agency to have to mitigate some of that violence, right? So like in the Renee Good case, for instance, Jonathan Ross goes in front of her car. That's not something that ICE is supposed to do. And ICE isn't supposed to do that because about a decade ago, there was an independent analysis that showed that, immigration officers would purposely get in front of vehicles to create the pretext to then use violence, which is exactly what he seemed to do, right? He went in front of her vehicle, he pulled out his gun, he created the context for that kind of violence. And so, I think this is very much just how ICE is. I think even the extent to which, people have been saying, oh, well, you shouldn't describe ICE in terms of like using Nazi language. But even that's not new. There's a Southern Poverty Law case from 2006 where that's already describing their tactics as Gestapo-like, because that's just what they are. And I guess like, so there's sort of 2 points, because I don't want to get rambly. But one, the primary way that ICE operates, like their basic strategy is attrition through enforcement. And attrition through enforcement nominally says that, well, we want to create conditions that are so hostile that immigrants will want to self-deport. And that's just their basic tactic, largely for financial constraints. So there was a memo or a press release that DHS released May 2025 that said that the average cost of arresting, deporting, and removing an undocumented immigrant is about $17,000 per immigrant, which is too expensive. So instead, you want them to self-deport, right? And the idea is that you create conditions that are very hostile to them, right? So you find employers, you find people who would give them jobs, you deny them access to IDs and access to other social benefits. But you also like over police them, right? You create an instance where you want to be terrifying so that these people will want to leave, right? And so terror has always been a tactic that ICE has wielded. What we're seeing now, and one of the ways in which this might be different, is only to the extent that Trump's DHS is both poorly trained and, like Trump, very sort of TV spectacle minded, right? So, raids on apartment buildings, ICE has been doing that basically from their inception. There are cases, ICE starts in 2003, and basically from the beginning have been doing raids of this nature, right? But now it's the Trump administration, right? So now we have to launch an aerial and ground assault on this Chicago airport, or on this Chicago apartment building, because it's terrifying, right? Because it creates the pretext where it's like, well, it could be any apartment. And so I think what we're seeing now is a kind of like heightened version of a lot of these things. And I guess like oh, sorry, you were going to ask something.
No, please go on and then I'll ask.
Okay.
You said you guessed there was one thing you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I mean, the only other comment was, so there was a recent interview in the Times where a former Secretary of Homeland Security was talking about how, well, he always got these questions about, how will we make sure that Homeland Security isn't turned against us, right? And his response was always like, well, the Constitution would protect us, right? And now we're sort of seeing the problem of having this kind of, aggressive surveillance state in the context of an administration that doesn't care about the Constitution.
One thing I wanted to talk about was a lot of people say, or I've had people say to me, oh, don't say abolish ICE, say reform. And I'm like, well, you're acting as if ICE is this, old institution within it's not that old. It's not, neither is the DHS. And I feel like these are products of the Bush era. And I feel like they've sort of, I don't want to overstate, but I've always disliked ICE. I've always disliked Department of Homeland Security because I think they lurch us towards sort of police state USA. Not to be overly exaggerative, but I think it lurches us towards a sort of militarized policing.
Yeah. And I think it's important to remember, right? Like even during 2002, right, when there were these debates about like, well, what should the Homeland Security Act at that point, right? Because Homeland Security at first is just the Office of Homeland Security in 2001, which only comes about a month after 9/11, right? And even then there were concerns, right? Even Republicans voiced concerns that like, aren't we just creating like a US KGB? Isn't this like super dangerous? But there was, at the moment, right, there were concerns, right? You didn't want to appear soft on terrorism. That was political suicide at that point. And so they kind of just were like, yeah, let's just fund this gigantic behemoth, right? We need to create the illusion that like we're being strong, right? And so like then just built it. But even from the beginning, something like DHS could only have been created in the context of something like 9/11 afterwards as a kind of reaction to it. And even the way that it's pieced together um, doesn't really make too much sense. And it was kind of arbitrary. Like, do you put the CIA in? Do you put the FBI in? Well, no,
It
you don't want
replaced,
to.
didn't it? Not to interrupt you, it replaced, I think, INS, right?
Yeah, so originally, immigration, it was the Immigration Nationalization Services, which was part of the Department of Justice. That gets basically split up into, and the enforcement wing becomes ICE. U.S. Citizenship Services becomes another part of it. So basically, INS gets broken up into a couple of different agencies, and then all of those get then put into ICE under the pretext that, well, the 9/11 terrorists came in via the country using like visas. And so now immigration has to be policed for its immigration potential. And that's also important because it's precisely that connection between immigration and terrorism, which is why now ICE is the largest, like the most well-funded law enforcement agency, right? That's
I think
why.
you may have misspoke. You said for its immigration potential. You meant for its like terrorist
Yeah,
potential.
sorry,
Or
sorry,
yeah.
sorry. Yeah, there's a sorry, thank you. Yeah, there's a right, like it conceptually links immigration enforcement with terrorism control, which is part of why it becomes part of Homeland Security. And that's part of the reason, the justification for continuing to fund it to such aggressive levels.
So, in other words, I wanted to get back to that point that I don't think this is a relatively, I mean, I'll put it this way. ICE is a relatively newer institution. It's only been around like what, some 20 years now. How do we respond to people that say, "Oh, it's a little bit too out there to say abolish ICE"? Because I think a lot of Americans are starting to agree with the idea of
Right.
abolish ICE. But how do you respond to the people that say, "Oh, we need to go for reform instead"?
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny line, right? Because like I think most of the people who are saying that don't realize that they're older than ICE. Like I'm older than ICE. Um, but also, I mean, reform it to what exactly? Um, Legally speaking, entering the country unlawfully is a civil offense. The violent criminals that Trump keeps saying that like ICE is detaining, well, no, like traditional law enforcement like actually detains them and then it processes them, checks their citizenship, and then transfers them over to ICE if it turns out that they're not a citizen. Sometimes it also does that incorrectly, but there's so it's not really clear why we need like what is the thing that we need ICE for? Because we're seeing what ICE is, right? Um, and so I guess I would just ask like what is the version of immigration enforcement that's contained within the Department of Homeland Security that would execute the function of immigration control more effectively than what we already have right now. In a way that doesn't just create this massive surveillance state, in a way that doesn't just threaten people indiscriminately of citizenship, in a way that doesn't just create some other massive police force. Um, so yeah,
And I
I just
think interestingly, you would apply this to DHS as well.
right,
Okay.
yeah. And again, I think with DHS, the argument is even more straightforward, right? Much of what's terrorism or of the acts that get labeled terrorism in the US are mostly domestic terror threats from groups that are labeled either white supremacist groups or anti-government extremist groups. But DHS doesn't really focus on either of those. Like most of those cases have been dealt with by like traditional law enforcement or just FBI or CIA, neither of which are part of the DHS. And in fact, like past secretaries of Homeland Security have actually like admitted that there is a bit of fear mongering that they do in order to justify their budgets. Because if you're the Department of Homeland Security and you want Congress to keep funding you, well, you need to create the justification for it. And well, if your justification for existing is to stopping terrorism, then you need to like elevate, and continue to to promote this idea that, yeah, there's all this terrorism. That's why you
It
like
becomes
totally
like a
need to
sort
be
of complex in and of itself. Yeah.
right, right. This kind of this sort of like political theater where, you know, we sell you the danger of terrorism so that you would then fund us to fight the terrorism, only that there is no terrorism. So now we're just spying on Americans and immigrants and everyone indiscriminately because, you know, who knows? Someone might be a terrorist.
Now, I want to get into the way that we've seen the Trump administration respond to the killings of Good and Preddy. I mean, we've basically heard talk of absolute immunity. We've seen the accusations that these two people gunned down were domestic terrorists. You know, we've seen the smears. Oh, Alex Preddy wasn't an angel because 11 days before. And I'm just like, I don't care what he did 11 days before. He wasn't a threat to anyone on the day you killed him. I mean, this is ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, the 11 days before point, it's an it so before I get into the other two, because the 11-day one I think is like the most bizarre one. Because so we're saying that, well, what Border Patrol did on that day, or what those Border Patrol agents did on that day was justifiable because 11 days ago, he kicked a taillight. So are we saying that like those Border Patrol agents knew who Alex Purdy was before engaging him? Because now it just seems like premeditated murder. If anything, that makes it seem so much worse. If we're saying that that is relevant, it can only be relevant if those border agents knew that. Because if they're completely two independent events, if those border agents had no idea about what happened 11 days ago, well, then it doesn't matter. So it's an odd position. I mean, even if we're saying that like, oh, well, he kept putting himself in danger, well, again, then he should have been like, you know, if anything, the case should be that he should be arrested and you know, face charges, go to trial, you know, not be executed in such a like violent manner. Um, so I think like, yeah, that part is particularly weird. As far as the domestic terrorism, that one is also crazy. But I think like if the Trump administration was going to respond in this sort of way, which I don't really understand why they've chosen to respond in this kind of a way, smearing them as domestic terrorists makes sense if you're, you know, an administration with fascist like aspirations. It's a way of legitimizing the violence. It's a way of, you know, like, yes, murdering someone sounds bad, but then there are certain categories of people that if you murder them, it's okay, right? Like if you murder your enemy, if you murder a criminal, if you murder a terrorist, right, then it's okay, right? And terrorist also functions in another way, right? Which, you know, you might want to say like, oh, well, I shouldn't have killed them. They were US citizens. Well, but if they're domestic terrorists, then they're really traitors. So sure, they might be American, but they're only American in some kind of flimsy sort of legal way. They're not true Americans, not real patriots. They're not the kinds of Americans whose rights we need to like observe, right? And so there's also a kind of like nominal uncitizening that happens there where you basically, by labeling them a domestic terrorist, you kind of recreate them as this, you know, fictional, quote unquote, illegal alien criminal that now ICE must stop because that's, you know, their whole deal. But it is crazy because we see the video and, you know, there's all these breakdowns that show that no, they were fine. There was no need for all this violence.
Well,
And
yeah, I
there's
think
no
they even have footage of them disarming him. I mean, he wasn't
right.
brandishing a gun. He had a concealed carry permit. I mean, I mean, the whole thing is just very bizarre.
Yeah, and even just like the turning on the Second Amendment, um, which I mean, again, if the idea is to silence the like, I guess at some point, if the Trump administration is truly trying to like just silence the public, then at some point they were going to have to attack Second Amendment rights at some point. I mean, they're already going for like voting rights. They're already going for, you know, right to like assemble. You know, the increasing threats to cancel the midterms. Um, but but yeah, I mean, it's just like in a context where there's so much footage and none of it points to anything that that justifies this state narrative. It's odd. I genuinely don't understand why they decided to respond in this manner. I thought for sure that the response was going to be that like this one particular ICE agent acted in the Renee Good case. I thought they were just going to throw that one agent under the bus, say that like yes, this one was a bad seed, and then try to like hush hush. But instead, they just went all in. It's alarming to say the least.
Well, this gets into your article, ICE's domestic terror threat. And you wrote that, I believe, before the. I mean, I know you did before the killing of Alex Preddy. I don't know if it was before Good's murder.
It was in
Um,
response to Good's
it
murder.
wasn't, yeah, it was the day after, I
Yeah,
believe. Do you
yeah,
want to go, because that headline, I know that caught my attention. ICE's domestic terror threat. Talk about that.
yeah. I mean, I guess some of it I've already sort of gotten to, but the idea is that yeah, ICE's main tactic has always been terror, scaring people to self-deport, scaring people into submission. They've made themselves scarier under the Trump administration, right? Using masks, the indiscriminate use of surveillance technologies, right? Like pointing the camera up, right? Because they're using, like Mobile Fortify and a number of these other apps that are recording your face, right? And they're doing this quote unquote to find some suspected immigrant, but it just is, making use of DHS's surveillance capabilities to find potential threats indiscriminately. Um,
I was going to say it's very, I love Oliver Stone's movies. And in JFK, there's a line in that movie where Garrison says, we're through the looking glass now. Black is white and white is black. I mean, that's sort of the situation we are with this. It's like the ICE is telling us, and the Trump administration is telling us, oh, Alex Preddy is a terrorist. Renee Good, this, single mother is the terrorist. But it seems like the people doing the terror are actually the state apparatus itself.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, right, like if you called them a terrorist, then well, even if you're doing the same thing, well, that's fine, right? It's sort of like if it's, even if your side does the same thing as your opponents do in a war, well, it's justified when your side does it, right? Because your side is doing it in the interests of like, what you represent, right? And so if ICE is meant to represent, real Americans, and then, and the emphasis, right, that like that ICE is just law enforcement and that they're just carrying out the laws, right? Like the line that like Tom Homan keeps like repeating, right? Like these are just, they're putting the laws, right? You don't like the laws, don't protest ICE, protest Congress. Again, right? Regardless of what they're doing, if they're the good guys, if they're protecting the law, and if these other people are domestic terrorists, then it doesn't actually matter, right? You know, shooting them 10 times in 5 seconds, well, they, better we kill the terrorist than allow the terrorist to live and do you harm in turn.
I wanted to ask you about Homan because I think a lot of people see it as a victory that Bavino is out. But I mean, maybe it is a victory, but I'm not sure it goes far enough.
No, it's, if anything, it's just um, if Trump is loud and sloppy, then, and that's closer to like the Bovino sort of style of leadership, then this is just a return to a more kind of cold and calculated Obama style immigration force. And I don't mean Obama there to, because I know some people like hear Obama and they're like, yay, like, no, Obama's ICE was brutal. There's a reason why among activists they call him the deporter in chief. I think this is, if anything, just a lateral move. I think he will create the same sorts of things will continue to happen. They might not be as loud and as flashy. But again, I mean, ICE is what ICE is, right? Even if you like rein it in such that it's not as much of a public menace, such that, it's only terrorizing specific communities, which is what it has been doing, right? Mostly like communities of color, which is largely what it's still doing. It's just, kind of broadening its scope a bit too much relative to what it has been doing. I think it's just a return sort of to form. It might not be as loud. We might not get as many headlines about it. And even then, it's only a maybe. Holman is certainly more efficient, and he's more knowledgeable because he's been doing this for such a long time. But it's still the case that these ICE agents are poorly trained. We know that they're poorly trained. The DHS has recently announced their wartime recruitment effort, which is another $100 million or so to recruit more ICE agents, but this time targeting people who are gun enthusiasts and military aficionados. So potentially targeting people to be part of ICE who may be a little too happy to exercise unchecked power. And then there's still the further context that the way that they dealt with the way they responded to Renee Good, I think, does set up the preconditions for Border Patrol to so aggressively go after Alex Preddy. Because if you tell them that they have absolute immunity, if the investigation into Jonathan Ross is actually more concerned with Renee Good's wife and her possible ties to activist groups than they are investigating Jonathan Ross, then if I'm immigration enforcement, I'm sort of thinking I have, carte blanche to do whatever I want.
I wanted to ask, because the debate I've been having with a lot of people, I've been frustrated at times because I agree that Trump is sort of utilizing agencies like ICE as a sort of a personal Gestapo in a way, right? But I also think we can't lose sight of the fact that there's structural issues that have led us to this moment. As you said, Obama, in the eyes of activists, was the deporter in chief. And then before that, we have the formation of ICE under the George W. Bush administration. How important is it to both understand the sort of cult of personality that Trump has and how he utilizes that, and his sort of using ICE as a Gestapo agency, with understanding the structural forces that got us here? Do we have to sort of square both together? I hope that makes sense as a question.
Yeah. So I think on the one hand, right, what ICE is now is the culmination of bipartisan efforts, right? So from 2003 to 2024, both Democrats and Republicans have consistently funded ICE and funded ICE in increasingly higher levels. They've also increasingly armed ICE with increasingly more intensive surveillance technologies. So what ICE is now is very much a bipartisan effort, right? It's not Biden and Obama were so much better with ICE than Bush and Trump in terms of the funding for it, right? Both administrations have contributed to it. Both administrations have enforced it. It's only gotten more and more stronger. The one thing that has widespread bipartisan support in our government is ICE. It's not anything else. It's just this, right? And part of it is because, again, right, it's Homeland Security, it's counterterrorism, right? No one wants to appear like they're against counterterrorism. So in those aspects, what ICE is now, right? It's not we just vote for Gavin Newsom or whoever.
No, well, that's my concern, because I don't want people to get the impression. I don't think people should lead themselves down a path where they think, well, if Trump goes away, then everything will just be dandy again. And I don't think that's true. I don't think it was even true with previous administrations with ICE. And I do think people should keep that in mind.
Oh yeah, definitely. Right. I mean, again, what ICE is now is what it's always been. Trump's recklessness and his sort of callousness makes the flaws of it more obvious, right? We see what an administration who really doesn't care about Congress, who doesn't care about the Constitution, who's actively empowered by the Supreme Court, but even if the Supreme Court defied him, it's not clear that he would really care. He would just call them activist judges and be on his merry way, right? this was always the fear of ICE. It was just always kind of kept in line by this presumption that, well, the president will care about. We sort of just assumed that these institutions would protect us because we assumed that the agents who were in control of them were either somehow benevolent, or at least their interests would align with maintaining that presumption, right? But yeah, if ICE stays the same, if the Democrats continue to fund ICE, if nothing structurally changes, and I mean like fundamentally changes, then even if we go vote blue, no matter who, and we get President fucking Gavin Newsom, then it's the same thing, right? We might not hear as many stories, right? Because there have been plenty of stories of ICE doing raids, doing workplace raids, breaking into people's apartments. Those stories have happened for decades. People haven't heard them because they've been more focused. But and we'll just return to form. Like those are really our alternatives, right? Like we either get loud ICE with Trump or quiet ICE with like an Obama or a Biden or a Bush or maybe a Gavin. But it's still just ICE, right? Nothing will fundamentally change, except that you might just not hear about it as much.
Now, is there any point at which you would say, well, the people that are pointing out that this is a little bit different with Trump may have somewhat of a point?
I mean, it's different in its scale and in its like disregard for like the Constitution, right? So sure, right? I mean, Christy Noem even said it, right? That in Michigan, it's the largest ever immigration enforcement mission ever or something. And she's right. Like sending 3,000 agents into Minneapolis, that's nuts, right? So there's something again, right? Like the spectacle is bigger, the production is bigger, the scale is bigger, right? Because it's Trump, right? And everything is gold and flashy and gaudy and loud. So it's different in execution, but it's not a difference in kind. It's not a difference in tactics. It's not a difference in how ICE operates. It's just a more careless version of it. A more careless version of it under like extremely tenuous, like even circumstances. Because like, why is ICE in Minneapolis? Because of this quote unquote Somali fraud network that was already under investigation. That they've tied, I think, 85 people of Somali descent have been tied to it, and have been, charged with something. A smaller number haven't actually been convicted. But that's why we need 3,000 agents. Again, it's just loud for the sake of being loud. And that's really the difference here, right? So yeah, like difference in presentation, not a difference in kind.
There's a few really important points I wanted to get into here. And one of the first ones I wanted to get into is I mentioned at the top of the conversation that you specialize in issues of race, immigration, and the politics of belonging. When it comes to some of the past episodes I've done on ICE and on this sort of, well, just these killings that are happening. I mean, good, pretty. I've sort of focused on it from a civil libertarian aspect because, like I said, I get very worried about the surveillance state, sort of militarized policing. But there is another part of this that does need to be addressed, and that is how it sort of ties into these collective psychic forces that, as you put it, are on a crusade to make America white again under Trump. Can you speak to how important it is that we do analyze that aspect of all this?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think that the largest movement ever, or that this largest like operation ever was done against Somalis, a group that is predominantly Black, predominantly Muslim. Like, I think that's not surprising. I think those are two groups, and many of them or well, I guess like about half of them are, and they're like a large like immigrant population. I think none of that is surprising, right? Like those are all things that are that speak against or speak towards this sort of like civilizational erasure that Trump keeps warning about, right? Right, he keeps pointing at Somalia as the example of, in his Davos speech, for instance, right? We can't keep mass importing foreign cultures that have, never succeeded in building a civilization of their own, right? There's that kind of ideology, right? Or another, or perhaps even the more clear example of it, is this quote by Stephen Miller, right? Advisor to Homeland Security. And he says that this is the great lie of mass immigration. You don't just import people, you import cultures. There's no magical transformation that occurs, right? Basically inferring, or actually just explicitly saying that if you allow immigrants to come in, they and their children and those children and their children's children will continue to reproduce these same sort of quote unquote failing cultures. And that's why, we need to get them out, right? And so if that's really what they're going for, that's really the ideology, then of course they don't really care if they're here legally or otherwise, right? If your thought is that, like, no, these people's like are just, their culture is bad, like fundamentally bad, and they won't Americanize, whatever that means. They will continue to reproduce their culture, and that culture will continue to lead to civilizational erasure, and will destroy the very special culture, as Trump put it, that built the West. Then they present an existential threat, irrespective of whether they're here, irrespective of the legal question, right? And so we have to target them so aggressively, right? And so a community that's, predominantly Muslim and Black becomes the target, right? Or now he says that he wants to go after Haitians in Ohio, right? Again, right, predominantly Black community. And so he's going to go after them, right? And so, yeah, right. And so the racialized aspect comes from this idea that, like, if you're not European or of European descent, then you just can't, then you will just always pose a threat to the country. And the only way to save the country is to get rid of you. And I think, like, perhaps maybe the clearest example of that. So there have been all these cases of ICE kidnapping these children in Minnesota, right? They kidnapped this like 5-year-old. More recently, they took a second grader and a fifth grader from the same school as that fifth grader. And so, and I forget, it was like the day after it happened, JD Vance spoke on it, and he basically defended them detaining like that child. But then the very next day, he speaks at the March for Life rally, and he says that, what I want to see more in America? I want to see more children, and I want to see more families. But it's like, wait, hold on. Yesterday, you were completely fine with ICE detaining a child, right? That they used as bait to try to lure the rest of his family out of his house. Like, you co-signed that. You said that was fine. But now today you're all like, you know what? We need more babies. And then he says that the mark of barbarism is to treat children as if they are a nuisance, right? He basically says, like, it's the mark of barbarism to treat children as if they are, an aberration, a nuisance, something to get rid of. And it's just insane, because just yesterday he was saying that, no, it's good that we got this 5-year-old. That 5-year-old shouldn't be here. So, but why isn't that the mark of barbarism? Because there is this kind of divide, right, between, like, these good people and good children who espouse the right kinds of values and the right kinds of culture. And yeah, right. And so when people talk about like ICE as, Nazi-like, Gestapo-like, I think it's important to recognize that they're not just like, that their primary goal is not really law enforcement, right? Like, most of the people that ICE is capturing, including that 5-year-old and his father, right? They entered legally. They have an active asylum case. They didn't have a deportation order, right? Most of who ICE is detaining are not violent criminals. Only about 5% of who ICE is detaining actually have any kind of violent crime conviction, and most of them have no conviction whatsoever. More than going after like law enforcement, they're cultural enforcement. And so they really are like a Nazi Gestapo like group, right? I think even the description of Renee Good and Alex Preddy as being domestic terrorists again, right? Like they're not really American. They don't have our values. They've been infected by some woke mind virus that has contaminated their thought process, right? They're not the kinds of values that we want. So I think that is also part of this, right? I think their policing is very much like racially, culturally motivated, in a way that ties into this broader, concern for civilizational erasure.
Now, the other part of this I wanted to ask you. So, you're given you're an associate professor of philosophy. I'm curious. How does your work in philosophy inform your thinking on these issues? And I was really interested in talking about that idea of the politics of belonging and how it ties into all of this, and how maybe people can resist.
Yeah. So the politics of belonging part, I kind of like sort of touched on implicitly, but basically, it's just concerned with um, what are the conditions under which someone can be said to really belong to a community, right? And there's plenty of ways that we can think about this, right? You can think of like, well, what it means to be a member of a group is to be formally accepted into the group, right? So there has to be a kind of like acknowledgement of it, right? You can talk about it in terms of legal terms, right? You're a citizen, and that's what makes you a part of this collective, right? We could talk about it in moral terms, right? You're a human, thus you're a part of the category of human, thus you have human rights. We could talk about it culturally. There's a couple of different ways to demarcate how we talk about who belongs and who doesn't belong. I think much of how ICE operates, both on a sort of superficial level, is about that, right? So on the superficial level, it's just that its primary mission is, immigrants versus citizens, right? It starts off with that dichotomy. It says that there are right. It's the presupposition of it is that there are certain conditions in which someone doesn't belong and thus must be removed from the U.S. And its whole point is to locate and deport those people who don't belong, or to create conditions that cause the people who don't belong to leave. But then there's the way in which, like in how they police, that exposes other layers, right? Like that they do go after people of color because they suspect them of not belonging, right? Already says something about like how they're thinking about who belongs and what a citizen looks like and what a citizen doesn't look like. That's a big part of their policing, which now they can do more explicitly because Brett Kavanaugh has already given them the okay that like, yes, you can use race among other factors to try to identify someone as being or not being an undocumented immigrant. And there was already sort of Supreme Court precedent for doing that sort of thing anyway. Then you get into other kinds of things, right? So the use of all these surveillance technologies, right? So there have been a number of cases where ICE has stopped someone, right? So there was a case in December in Minnesota. There was a case earlier and there have been a couple of cases like this, right? Where someone has like either where ICE has stopped someone or detained someone and then said, show me your papers, right? And ICE, and they've been like, okay, here are my papers, right? But then ICE was like, I don't accept these papers. Like, I'm going to scan your face and do a biometric scan, right? And if the biometric scan says that you're undocumented, even if you can present documentation, they'll detain you, right? So there was, just to give a more concrete case, there's a case of a woman, US citizen. She's detained by ICE for 25 days in December, right? Her lawyers present her birth certificate and say, like, she's a US citizen. But ICE refuses, and DHS refuses to accept it, right? They say that no, she's not, right? We know that she's illegal. We're not going to accept it, right? And so even then, right, like this document is supposed to affirm that you belong, but now they can just declare that it doesn't because, biometric scan, we think it's fake, whatever reason, right? And so like, philosophically, that's sort of the question, right? Like, well, what are these shifting parameters? How do these parameters change culturally? How do like new technologies change this, right? If what it means to be verified as a citizen has nothing to do with like your citizenship, like documentation, but this biometric scan, then it actually seems like it's this scan that now confirms or disconfirms that you're a citizen or not. And then what are the potentials for that, right? So for instance, right, like given the precedent that DHS has set with respect to how they just don't accept IDs, why should any of us be okay with this SAVE Act? Clearly, IDs don't matter. They're not proof of citizenship. ICE has spent the last year and the last 13 months proving that that does improve citizenship. So philosophically, that's the sort of thing that I do. As far as how we resist, it's tough. It's sort of a hard question because
well, maybe a better question is, have you been heartened at all by how people have been resisting in terms of protest?
Oh yeah, no, I definitely think that the ICE out protests, this sort of economic blackout. I think if there is one way that we can really get the Trump administration to resist, I think that is the way. Because if there is one thing that Trump cares about, it's the economy and being able to brag about how we're the hottest economy in the world. And that is something that we can take away from him, meaningfully take away from him. Obviously, it would be better if Democrats would, not continue to fund ICE, if they would put more meaningful guardrails, if they would, impeach Kristi Noem, which again, I don't think would meaningfully radically change anything. But I think at least creating the pretext that that your actions will be held accountable would go some ways towards mitigating some of this violence, right? So I don't think that's a solution in and of itself, but I think it at least would help to some extent. So yeah, I even just the extent to which abolishing ICE is becoming a more popular position, right? And you get all these celebrities at the Grammy saying fuck ICE and ICE out.
I mean, I'm in a suburb where I'm hearing white house moms saying abolish ICE. So
yeah, and
people
on
you
the
wouldn't
one hand,
expect.
right? And on the one hand, I never thought I'd see the day. I had that position way back, not to be a hipster about it. But it's also, so on the one hand, that's great, right? It sucks how we got here, right? That we needed to watch people get state executed in order to arrive at this position. But at least we're here now. And at least we have this forward momentum. I think these ICE out protests, I think this kind of economic blackout, I think this sort of look, if you're gonna police us, if I can't go outside my home, and sometimes even if you're inside your home, right? So there was a case of these ICE agents threw this gas canister indiscriminately at this crowd, and some of that gas started going inside the nearby homes and the nearby businesses. And it's well, look, if you're telling me that I can be inside my house and you might just break in, there was a case in Minnesota where this guy's just taking a shower and ICE just breaks into his home, takes him out of his underwear, US citizen, they just got it wrong. If that can be the case, if I can get killed while trying to help someone get up, who's being knocked down, if I can be in my own home and still get tear gas, then I opt out. I opt out of whatever it is this is, right? I think that can be effective. Obviously, I think the Democrats should do more. I don't understand why they're not there's so much forward momentum on this. It's such an increasingly popular position. All they have to do is just listen to the polls. They usually love listening to the polls. I don't understand why they don't want to listen to this poll.
If you have a few more minutes, I also wanted to ask you, we mentioned the sort of surveillance state aspect of this earlier. I don't know how much you've gotten into things like the role Palantir is playing in ICE with these apps they're making, but it's all very scary. And I think it should concern all US citizens, regardless of their political affiliation, race, anything, because it's just, I mean, it's one, it seems like we're lurching towards something, a giant domestic surveillance police state, like I said at the beginning.
And in fact, there was reporting, I want to say July of last year, right? Sometime summer 25, where it was reported that ICE is seeking proposals from contractors, and they want to build a social media surveillance network to track anti-ICE sentiment, right? And they would be tracking it internet wide, right? Which also goes towards these like domestic terror lists that we've been finding more out about, right? These various lists that have been tracking people who are, anti-ICE or anti-Israel, that are just
Zero consideration for people's privacy.
right, right. And again, right, and that also goes towards this label, the function that being called domestic terrorist has, right? Well, of course, if you're a domestic terrorist, we don't care about your right to privacy. You don't have a right to privacy. You are a threat to us, right? And that also goes towards it, right? Like, because saying that, calling someone a terrorist is one of like the more prominent ways of saying that you don't belong, right? And in fact, it's not just that
you are not legitimate.
Right, yeah. Right. You're not legitimate. And moreover, you are an enemy. And to our enemies, we can't grant any rights. And so, yeah, so on that presumption, well, we can surveil indiscriminately. Anyone who's on this list is a terrorist. Thus, we're not violating any of their rights because they don't have rights, because they are a terrorist that mean us wrong. And so there's this kind of circular logic that fuels more surveillance. And because DHS's budget continues to grow, because there's so much money to be made off of surveillance technologies by all these companies, Palantir, but also like Amazon, Microsoft, it just continues to grow. There's just so much financial incentive. There's not enough guardrails to stop them.
I don't want to sound like one of those old hippies, but it's like the old observation about the military industrial complex almost.
Yeah. Yeah, right. And I mean, Palantir is a part of the military industrial complex, right? I mean, and there's a whole, that could be a whole other thing to itself.
That could be a whole nother show, but
right.
I know I can't keep you forever here. So we've covered a lot of different issues here. What's the one thing you would hope my listeners take away from this conversation? I feel like we couldn't go over everything because you've written, I think it was like 5 articles in the past month. So I would just recommend people read those, because you'll get an even bigger picture from reading all of those. But what's the one thing you want my listeners to get out of this conversation?
I guess, and this is gonna sound a little corny, but like it's not, right? Don't give in to despair, right? Like there's a way in which, all of these things can seem silencing, right? It can be very easy to see like what happened to Alex Preddy, this excessive use of force, and then this total defense by the Trump administration, and then go, yeah, maybe I'm just going to not protest or say anything because, right? And even just listening to this conversation, you might have, your takeaway might be like, oh, I didn't realize things were that bad. Yeah, never mind. I'm just going to stay in my home forever and not do anything, right? That can't be our response, right? Like I think it was in that ICE is a domestic terror paper, where I talk about like, look, we usually talk about checks and balances within a democracy, right? But the people are one of the checks to that balance, right? So, if the judicial and if the legislative isn't going to do its role, then we have to be the check, right? And there are things we can do, right? Withholding our labor, withholding our spending power, right? Those are meaningful actions that we can do, right? If you can protest ICE, if you can, write, try to pressure your politicians, if you can run for office yourself, these are all meaningful ways that we can try to, resist. And again, right, we're sort of in a position where it's not going to get better by itself, I don't think. So
I know this is probably too big a question to ask at the end, but so we say abolish ICE, but then what do we want beyond that? I guess what I mean is, I think you and I probably have a vision for a world we want to live in that doesn't have a DHS or an ICE. And what do you think that world would look like? And I promise to let you go after this.
Okay. So I mean, look, at least in the near future, I think we're very much far away from like the kind of future that we might like envision. But sure, like for the time being, there's going to be some kind of immigration enforcement. But I think that we can have immigration enforcement that, one, makes sense of the fact that the vast majority of undocumented immigrants commit far fewer crimes than U.S. citizens, right? We can have a system that treats them with dignity. That also, like, it's a legally, it's a paperwork problem. Like, we have ways of dealing with that, right? We don't need all of these raids. We don't need all these workplace raids. We don't need this much violence and this much surveillance, because again, there's no way of doing all these raids and all that violence and all these surveillance without indiscriminately targeting everyone. And we're targeting these people for what exactly? The ones who do commit a crime, guess what? They're caught by like traditional law enforcement. We don't need this extra thing, this extra militarized police force. I think also part of that is that we need to also stop, like, the sort of constant regime change, all this, like, the Trump's renewed colonial Dontro efforts, right?
Oh, the Western Hemisphere domination project.
Right. I mean, all of that is also part of it, right? Like, it's very ironic for Republicans to say, like, oh, I don't understand why all these, like, Somali people are here. Where it's like, well, what do you mean? Like, we bombed them in the 90s. We've throughout the 70s and 80s, they were Somalia and Ethiopia get wrapped up in this like Cold War conflict. Like, there are obviously lots of historical factors that lead to the conflict in like Somalia and the reason for like the displacement and the dysphoria. But the US does bear a responsibility there, right? Like, we also contributed to their displacement. We are also part of the reason that they're here. And now that they're here, they are contributing. Maybe they're not making the contributions that some people want, right? Because part of their contribution is like a culture that someone might deem, quote unquote, inferior. But you're just wrong then, if that's your position. So I think, yeah, like we can police in a way that respects their personhood, that respects like, even if you don't really care about undocumented immigrants, you should at least care about your own rights, and you should at least care that DHS and ICE is also violating your rights to the extent that they're violating other people's rights. And we need to change how we interact with other countries, because we are also fueling this mass migration problem that we then are criticizing. And we can't have it both ways. We can't condemn mass migration while also being a catalyst for mass migration. And so, yeah.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. I will mention
Okay.
one thing real quick, because you mentioned it. I was just I was scrambling to find it, but there's this Libertarian Institute, the Cato Institute, and even they have said, they have an article that came out and a study that came out. 5% of people detained by ICE have violent convictions. 73% have no convictions. So
Right.
even people that aren't like hardcore left-wingers are saying this,
Yeah.
and I think people should really start looking at this and understanding it. I want to thank you again, Jordan Liz, for coming on Parallax Views. How can my listeners keep up with your work? Thank you so much, by the way.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for having me. Yeah, I mean, most of my op-eds, I've been publishing them on Common Dreams. So if sort of for public writing, that's mostly like where I've been writing my pieces. That's probably like the easiest way. I mean, I don't, like, at this point, I don't even know what social media platform would be safe or even reliable to use, because it's only a matter of day before some billionaire buys it and then throttles it according to their own ideological positions. But
That's a whole nother episode I have to
right,
do
that's a
something
whole
on.
other episode. But yeah, Common Dreams, if you want to read more of my stuff. Yeah.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/Parallax Views, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program.
Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.